I'm really excited about today's Tech Talk. It's very timely. If you joined early, you heard several of us just chatting away about the CISA advisory about Shields Up. Other countries have produced similar advisories. The White House had a briefing, a brief that they released recently around sort of hardening your cybersecurity just with the sort of geopolitical situation right now. So very timely Tech Talk today. As a reminder, Tech Talks are part of the Experts Conference, and this is a small taste of what the Experts Conference is like. It's really boots on the ground, sort of training, education, talking with the experts, getting your questions answered. It's not the product pitches. It's, Tech is sponsored and hosted by Quest, but during the Tech Talks, during Tech sessions, we're not pitching our products. This is really just providing access to that experience to help you with the projects you're working on. And with that in mind, I do want to take a few more minutes before we dive into and introduce our panelists today. I want to talk a little bit about the Experts Conference. So what you're going to see here today is just a small taste of what you would get at the Experts Conference in Atlanta, Georgia, September 20 and 21. This is our first in-person event since 2019, so we're excited that we'll be there in person. It'll be a smaller conference, probably 400 max, but we have the entire Lowe's hotel, so we've got plenty of room to spread out. And so I would encourage you guys to take a look at this. We focus on Microsoft 365, Microsoft Infrastructure Security, Microsoft On-Prem, and hybrid management and migration. And this year for our keynotes, we have Chris Dancy returning. He was joined us last year, and he was great at bridging what our keynotes are talking about and helping you think through how you could apply it personally and to your work environment. We've got Paula Yanuskevich. She's back this year as a keynote, giving the hacker's perspective to help you prioritize where you should be spending your time and your budget when it comes to cyber defense. And a lot is going to change between now and September. So I'm excited to see what she'll talk about. And Rich Tandon is joining us as a keynote. He is the Corporate Vice President of Teams Engineering. So he's the guy that says, this goes into Teams, this doesn't, this is how we roll out our releases. I had a great conversation with him recently about how they handled scaling Teams during the pandemic. I know he's going to talk a little bit about that, as well as just all this other cool stuff that goes into Teams. If you are an ISC Squared member, Quest is an official CP submitter. As the host of Tech, we can submit those CPs on your behalf. So if you register, make sure you put your ISC Squared member ID, and then you'll get credit for attending. And we take care of all the paperwork for you. Just a quick dive into the tracks, different people we have there. We're excited about our lineup. Sean Metcalf, who's one of our panelists today, he is returning. So is Alex Weinert. He's the Director of Identity Security at Microsoft. Shanessa Cambrick is on his team, and she's going to be there this year. Andy Robbins with SpectraOps and Bloodhound is speaking. And of course, we've got many more in our security track. We've got a whole Microsoft 365 track, Tony Redman, Christina Wheeler, Laura Rogers, Mark Rackley will be there talking about the graph, Teams, Power Platform, and Teams, all sorts of wonderful sessions. And then our on-prem and hybrid management migration track is an interesting track. Lots of different things that going on there, including tenant-to-tenant migrations with Becky Cross. Jeff Goulet is going to talk about Exchange Online. We've got George Lopez, who's also from Alex Weinert's identity security team at Microsoft. And of course, our other panelists today, Michael Van Horenbeek, will be presenting at Tech in this track. So just want to encourage folks to register. It should be in the link. I think Lance is going to post a link, so you could go out and see. The agenda is like 95% done, so you could pretty much see what you're going to see and what you're going to get for going there. And then one more shout out before I turn it over to the panelists. We have our next Tech Talk coming up April 28th, and this is with Quest's own Microsoft MVP, Mike Weaver, and he's going to be talking about the lessons learned that he has learned through Microsoft 365 tenant consolidation, and specifically in an M&A scenario. So tenant consolidations have their own, challenges, and then you throw like M&A timelines on top of that, and it expands those challenges even more. So he's going to be talking through what he's learned, and we're going to be in a similar setting like we are today, which is a team meeting. So the chat will be open, and you can ask a lot of your questions that way. So before I introduce the panelists, I do want to mention I turned off the video and the audio, except for our panelists, just so we can keep the focus on them. But the chat is open, and we will be engaging in the chat. Myself and my colleague Dan will be monitoring the chat too. If there's a particular question, we want to make sure that we get over to Brian, our moderator, to ask the panelists. We'll highlight that, or we'll gently interrupt and bring that to their attention. But feel free to use the chat throughout this presentation today. With that, I'm going to introduce our moderator, my colleague, Brian Patton. He's a principal strategic systems consultant here at Quest. He focuses in on Active Directory, identity governance, and I'm really excited that he will be moderating this panel. If you've been to TEC before and you've liked a lot of our security speakers, you could probably thank Brian for that. I've worked closely with him over the years to help identify speakers. He is always staying up with the latest, following the people that are really giving out the good information. In fact, he was the one that I recommended Sean and Michael a couple years ago, so we can thank him for that. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our panel.
Great. First of all, we have the infamous Sean Metcalf, who is the creator of 80security.org, which is a great community website that I encourage everybody to look at to learn about a lot of different best practices around Active Directory. He is also the founder of Trimark Security, and he is a Microsoft Certified Master around Active Directory. Also, we have with us Michael Van Hornbeck, who is one of the authors. I first learned about the Microsoft 365 Security IT Pros. It's a fantastic book and resource for everybody to use. He is also the CEO of The Collective and yet another Microsoft Certified Master. So we got some smart guys with us today. And I'm thinking the first question I want to kind of go to, we were talking about the Shields Up program earlier. And Michael, I have a lot of bias because I'm in the US, right? So I have a different perspective. A lot of stuff has been happening lately in the world, a little bit closer to where you live. What's the general feeling of organizations that you're working with? What are people doing a little bit differently than maybe they did even 2 months ago? Can I kind of get to the feel of what's going on over the ocean where you're living at in Belgium?
So, yeah, I mean, a lot has changed, right, over the past couple of months, that's for sure. And one of the things that it that did bring with is a heightened, should I say, awareness of security. And more specifically, people are worried because they do realize that warfare is now also partially or largely digital, and there's a lot of potential for collateral damage, right? We all see the news where there are talks about attacks on utility companies within Ukraine, obviously, but it also means that organizations within the rest of Europe that work in utilities or that are utility providers or whatever it is, they're increasing their detection capabilities. They're on high alert, I would say. It's not that everyone's like panicking, but everyone's aware that the threat is real and that they need to do something about it. And for better and worse, I think it's a good thing because people are slowly starting to understand that they need to do stuff, not just because things are happening in Ukraine, but slowly but surely after a couple of years they've learned that these things are real. So.
Sean, kind of going over a little bit closer to home in North America, I know you deal with a lot of different large customers. What are you seeing? Are people changing their approaches around protection and whatnot?
Certainly. Yeah, and I apologize for my voice. It's a bit raspy. I was at a security conference over the weekend, and speaking through a mask for 3 days isn't the best way to exercise the voice. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the challenge I see, Brian, is the challenge that we've seen and had for years. I mean, I think that a lot of organizations have not changed how they actually do administration. We still see that they aren't using some sort of admin systems, and apparently admins are putting admin passwords and credentials into Excel files and other text files. Talking with my friends that are pen testers and red teamers, they say that somewhere around half of their engagements, they find some sort of password in a text file or a file on the network. And very often it says password on it. So there is concern around increased attacks against US-based companies or global companies that are in Eastern Europe. There are concerns around how to harden that. And I think that it's emphasizing or underscoring the fact that we haven't been doing what we really need to be doing. A lot of it comes down to the basics, the fundamentals, making sure that we're doing the right things that we should have been doing for years. And on top of that, that we're getting the right auditing and event configuration so that we can see what's happening. So it's a combination of proactive protection as well as ensuring that we have the appropriate visibility into what's going on. I mean, we still find domain controllers that don't have appropriate auditing. With Active Directory certificate services, the default is no auditing. So there is no auditing for that. VMware, very seldom do we see that auditing is enabled on that or that it even goes into a SIM. So the visibility on a lot of these systems is just not there. So the next step is, how do you know that you're under attack, or how do you know that someone is doing something they shouldn't?
So that leads to one of the different things that CISA is recommending. And Michael, is there any advisories like other than CISA that you're kind of staying to around, like, hey, you need to detect stuff very quickly. You need to get a little bit faster. So first, Michael, is there any other agencies that we should be following in North America to kind of be a little closer to data over there? I'm assuming you're following CISA as well.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the companies that we work with, we look at different organizations. Obviously, ISO is very big in Europe, but that's more, a certification framework, not really, putting out advisories out there. So we do look at what NIST is doing, what CISA is doing. We look at our national cert. So Belgium has a national cert. Every country in Europe has their own cert. And typically, whenever the Netherlands put out an advisory, we'll see that one as well, or we'll follow that one as well. Or the UK has a really good office as well. So we kind of tend to follow the different countries for what they're seeing and try to make up some things for ourselves. So rather than we have a European one too, but it's kind of all these other countries contributing to that. And we see very regular recommendations of, do improve this, do improve that. But what kind of frightens me or stupefies me is the fact that they keep returning or recurring the same things. It's like, please do increase logging. Like Sean said earlier, that it keeps baffling me that whenever we are engaged during a hack, or last time we spoke, it was on the exchange attack that we saw last. Yeah, Hafnim, right? So we have our SOC, and every customer that we start engaging with, like, we're opening eyes and we're like, but how did you not increase logging level on your domain controllers or auditing, right? Or why are you clearing your security logs when they're full? And by the way, why are they only 100 megs? They're keeping the Windows defaults. So I think, there's two things that's definitely wrong. First of all, the defaults shouldn't be 100 megs or whatever they are today, right? They should come out of the box with 5 gigs and no overrides of the security logs, for one. And secondly, people really need to start increasing their basic hygiene stuff. Like, if you follow the sys controls, you get that stuff. Like, you get PowerShell script block logging, you get the increased security logs, you get at least some tools to start better detecting if something is happening in the environment. But the fact that after so many years, we still need to reiterate the same message over and over again, that just gets to me every single time.
So, Michael, just to follow up to that, you said organizations that have a SOC. Do all the organizations in Europe have a SOC?
Oh, hell no. So this is one of the reasons why our company is growing like crazy, because a couple of years back we started offering a SOC service, but more geared not towards the larger organizations, because they typically have their own SOC,
Yeah.
or they organize it in a different way, but kind of like democratizing the SOC capabilities to other organizations. But I'd say 1 out of 10 has their own SOC or something in the sorts, which is mind-boggling, because if you're not looking at things, how on earth do you even know that something's happening? And that's how we get to these numbers where, what's the average time before a breach is detected? 200 and odd something days. Well, I'm not surprised. If no one's looking at the alerts or at the data, then you're not going to detect anything.
Same thing for you, Sean. How many organizations do you see that actually have a SOC, and how many of those SOCs really even understand Active Directory?
I'd say the number is quite a bit higher, just because of our customer base, primarily in the U.S. We tend to work with a lot of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 customers, and but beyond. I mean, from anywhere from a few hundred users to over 900,000 is what we've worked with in the past, I don't know, 5 or so years. Those that do have SOC, the folks that work in the SOC generally don't know all of the different ins and outs of Active Directory. Certainly not all the ins and outs of Active Directory security. The customers that we work with, one of the reasons why they hire us is to help them better understand how Active Directory security works and the things that matter within it, all the different things that could be configured that an attacker could take advantage of. But more than that, to identify the unknown unknowns, the things that they don't know. I fully recognize that operations' job is to fight fires and to keep things running and keep uptime. And then every so often, security lobs this report over the fence and says, "Here, remediate this." That's painful for operations. So you do have organizations that's like, you know what, we're not going to get any sort of security assessment because we know that we have things to clean up and fix. The problem there is prioritizing and resourcing. I mean, I like to say that every organization has finite resources. It doesn't matter if you're Walmart or if you're XYZ Corp down the street that has 20 people, right? The only difference there is that Walmart, for example, has teams for just about everything because they are at the size that they can. A company in the middle probably has teams for some things, but not for others. They'll have an Active Directory team, an Azure AD team, maybe an Azure team, or maybe in the smaller company, they'll have one team that does all of that. And that team is one person. So in that instance, how does that one person keep track of everything? It becomes very difficult. It becomes a 2 jobs, basically. They have to keep everything running and keep it secure, which is very difficult. And now that these companies have expanded into the cloud, it becomes even more, because they had 2 full-time jobs. Now they have 4 full-time jobs. They have the on-prem operations, on-prem security, now cloud operations and cloud security. And as Michael said, Microsoft does not provide secure defaults, which just blows my mind. It seems like the defaults for Microsoft systems are often for lab environments. In the cloud, they provided Teams integration between personal Teams accounts and corporate Teams account, and that was just turned on by default. So now any personal Teams account can message any corporate Teams account. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So
if I may add something on top of that, right? What we're seeing is, I'm just going to call them cloud natives these days. So the younger workforce are coming in. They're like 20 odd something right out of school. They start working, and they're cloud experts. Well, quote unquote. They know, all they know is cloud, right? Azure AD, AWS, GCP, whatever it is. Their focus is on the cloud, and then all of a sudden they get to this thing called Active Directory. And then, whenever there's an issue with it, they look at it and be like, yeah, well, what is this thing, right? So what I see is that the level of knowledge of Active Directory is actually diminishing, right? It's not just that it's a problem that has always existed, because AD has always been, quite difficult at some level, right? Easy at some level, but difficult to really grasp and really understand, to what Sean said. But now we're getting less people that really understand what it is. Like, even within our own company, and I don't mean that in a bad way, right? I work with a lot of young people that come fresh out of school, and when I talk to them about Kerberos, they look at me and be like, yeah, we know it's something about authentication, but when we dive in just a little deeper, like TGT, TGS, what the KRB TGT account is for, they look at me and be like, yeah, we have no clue what you're talking about. But that's a problem, because these same people are now responsible for other organizations to keep everything running and keep everything secure. But how on earth are you going to do that if you don't really understand the basics, right? So the skills shortage in general, I believe that's going to be a huge problem, not just for cloud, right, but also on-prem, because it's still there. It's going to stay there for 5, 10, 15 years to come, for sure. And the attack surface of that on-prem is still, in my opinion, a lot larger, and it's still the biggest problem. So,
hey guys, we actually have a really good question that's timely around this knowledge gap. How would you suggest learning more about the inner workings of Active Directory on-prem for someone that might have that knowledge gap?
Well, so nothing beats experience, in my opinion. So if looking at my story, right? Because I can't tell how you should do things. Like, this is great, do this, because I'm not a person that learns from video. I honestly, I don't. I'm a person that reads books, and I can read books really quickly, and then that's how I learn stuff, and then I do things. I've got my lab, my home lab. I just start doing stuff. That's how I learn. That's how I've always done it, and I've always had the opportunity to do projects around these things, which is how I got to learn stuff. The challenge that we have these days is, there's plenty of good resources, but not all that great resources. Sean's website is one of them, where I regularly point people to, there's a great resource over there if you want to talk about AD, really understand certain things. But the golden olden days where you could get a really deep dive, training on AD just doesn't exist anymore, in my opinion, right? It's all cloud and everything is shiny. Even the Pentester Academy stuff is all focused towards the cloud, and then they give you some points or some talking points about AD, but it's a problem. So maybe Sean, you have better ideas or better recommendations.
No, you're right on target with that, Michael, unfortunately. And Microsoft's focus has been away from Active Directory. I mean, Michael and I and Pat and Brian we've all seen that Microsoft has de-emphasized Active Directory for Azure AD. I mean, it makes sense from a corporate perspective because everyone's going cloud eventually, right? So the challenge is that when Active Directory is not really getting updated, I mean, the last real update we saw to it from a Forest perspective was 2016. I think there were some minor updates to the actual underworkings or core of components of Active Directory at that level or at that version. And there's a lot of content. It was mentioned that the TechNet went away. I mean, Microsoft just whole forklifted all the content and data that everyone has been using since I started over 20 years ago, forklifted that over to Docs. And now all those links are broken. So that means all this knowledge, such that people used to read, like Ned Pyle's Active Directory mailbag, which was one of the golden sources of knowledge when I was an AD admin engineer, managing and administering an AD environment. But one of the things that we are in a time where virtualization is basically available for everyone. So whether it's VirtualBox or something else, you can virtualize systems on your computer. So at least with Active Directory, you can download a 30-day trial. You can, rearm that effectively, set it up and use it for 6 months. So you can have a lab that you can use for 6 months. And quite honestly, I burn my labs down after 6 months or so because I've usually wrecked them by then. So you can set up a couple of systems and test out Active Directory. When you talk about the cloud, you usually have to use a credit card. So that's the challenge with the cloud. You get 30 days to test something out, but then it expires, and you need to pay some sort of money to use it. So learning cloud has some costs associated with it. Learning Active Directory, the cost is lower, but the other challenge is there might be a lot of information out there. Some of it's older. I will say one of the benefits of that is just about anything that came out around Active Directory in the 2008 timeframe is going to be fairly current for what you have today, other than some minor features here and there. And the core replication, some of the other things are still, they still go back to 2003 or even to 2000. So just because you see an old article, go ahead and read it because it probably has some good information about how the core system works. And I want to make one point. That when Michael's talking about knowledge and what's happening with companies and having people that can do Active Directory, I'm seeing a lot of companies, especially large companies, completely outsource Active Directory administration to managed service providers. And this means that they are entrusting the security of their entire company with this outsourced company. And we saw this with Lapsus, basically they compromised Citel, and then they jumped over there to Okta to gain access to a console. to be fair. So this is happening a lot. I mean, effectively, the attackers are looking at how they can get access. I mean, even if you go back to, I believe it was the Target hack, the Target company hack back in 2016 or so, that was through an HVAC company that had access into their network. And while they had a lot of things a lot of security there were certain things that weren't being looked at. So attackers are looking at these connection points, how things interconnect, how things are created, and how they're put together in order to ensure that operations is done more efficiently, ensure that the business operations is done more efficiently. And that's the core of my talk at TEC.
So unfortunately, it sounds like there's a big knowledge gap around Active Directory. I think everybody on this call agrees with that. A big part of CIS's advice is reducing the likelihood of a damaging cyber intrusion, which typically starts with AD as well. So since people don't really have time as their friend, what configurations do you think people should be looking at implementing in their environment first? They can have the biggest impact to reduce the likelihood of an intrusion. I'll open that up for either Michael or Sean.
So I'll jump in on that first. I think the first thing that can be done is looking at the baseline security policy settings for the workstations, the servers, and domain controllers. CIS has some good information about how to set those. It's a little bit above what Microsoft recommends, but it helps raise the bar a little bit. There's a number of things that can be done, checking the security and making sure that things are appropriate in the environment. Trimark have published something back a couple years ago that had an article and a PowerShell script that can be run. We'll throw that in the chat. That's a good way to ensure that sort of these low-hanging fruit type security items in Active Directory can be handled. The other part of it is making sure that in the environment, the appropriate auditing is configured. As I said, Microsoft has good guidance on how to make sure that gets configured. So we want to make sure that the administration is handled correctly, the auditing is handled correctly. And then from a ransomware perspective, one of the best ways to really frustrate ransomware is to have host-based firewalls enabled, especially filtering SMB traffic. Basically, there's no reason for workstations to accept traffic to them, except in the smallest organizations where maybe they're hosting a printer. Okay, fine, then that one gets an exception. But there's no reason today in 2022 that all workstations can communicate with all workstations on every port, basically. It takes a little bit of work to figure out how to do it, but once you do it, and I've seen very large organizations deploy host-based firewalls successfully, including the Windows one, doing that plus implementing Microsoft LAPS and making sure those local admin passwords actually rotate, that will really frustrate attackers as well as ransomware, because the ease of lateral movement just doesn't happen as quickly. Now, of course, there's a ton of other things, but in a short segment here, those are a few that I can call out.
Michael, did he miss anything?
Yeah, no. That's all great points, and quickly want to respond to what you said. Like, AD being the primary target. It is a primary target. It is, but it doesn't start with AD, right? What we see is it starts elsewhere, and then they jump to AD because that's where they want to be, right? Taking a look at Log4j, right? That was a gift, but it's not affecting AD per se. It's affecting anything connected within the network, gives them into the AD, and then they go straight for AD, right? So to that point, to what Sean said, is you have to make sure that you've got your house in order in different levels. Right? This is one of the reasons why I am a huge fan of the NIST cybersecurity framework, because when you take a look at the different phases, and let's skip the first and the last one, protect, detect, respond, right? Do what you can to protect your environment, then make sure that you have all the appropriate detection mechanisms to detect that something's going on, and then make sure that when you detect something, that you know how to respond to that, and you do that at different levels with different solutions, with basically everything that's running within your network. But vulnerability management in general, with anything, right? Workstations, servers, applications, anything that you've got running is super important. Not just because of these 0 days, because even a good vulnerability management program that you may have, and let's assume that you deploy any patch within 2 days of it becoming available, won't save you from any 0 day, but it's not always these 0 days that get exploited, right? It's the ones that are there for years and years and years. that allow attackers to jump from one thing to another and then exploit certain systems within the network. From an AD perspective, you can turn on any auditing, deploy any solution what you want, but then all it takes is one misconfigured GPO that is writable, right? And everything's gone anyway, right? So it is across the stack, making sure that you have all the checklists, everything that you need, deployed, configured, following up, making sure that there's no unauthorized changes as well, because these are the things that you need to do, whether it's on-prem or the cloud doesn't really matter. And in the cloud, by the way, it's not just software, it's security posture management, configuration management, making sure that you keep following up on changes. To what Sean said earlier, right? The defaults. Whenever Microsoft puts out a new feature, they like to turn it on by default. And the reason why they do it, I get it, right? Because if they turn it off, people have to turn it on, and therefore adoption of such a feature is low. So PMs, they love turning things on because then lots of people start using that feature. But as a consequence, some of these features may have a security impact, like general Teams users talking to the professional Teams users, I would say, corporate accounts. And why is it a security challenge? Because just people chatting. Well, it's a phishing channel. We see Teams being abused as a phishing mechanism. It's not just email. If I can get to pretty much any corporate account, I can pretend being God knows whom, just start sending them a message. Hey, by the way, could you do this or that for me, rather than a message? And I now have yet another attack avenue. So these things are similar, very different, but also things that you have to look into.
Now, I've seen some more different questions coming in talking about lapse and other stuff around AD. It kind of reminds me, Microsoft retired the recommendation for the Red Forest. They have their new enterprise access model talking about the control plane. I've seen many of my customers who have not implemented lapse that still log on with domain admins down to workstation level. So can somebody, just share like, hey, what is tier 0 for on-premises as well as the cloud, and anything that you may want to add about that? I mean, is tier 0 still a term, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Michael.
No, please.
It absolutely is. I think Microsoft spent years training all of us to know that tier 0 was important. It's domain controllers. It's the management of domain controller. It's anything that connects to a domain controller and manages it and controls it, has admin rights on it, runs any agent that runs a system on a domain controller. That's tier 0. And then in addition to that, you've got to also look at the other most critical things in your environment. PKI is tier 0. VMware administration, I think that's tier 0 too. It has to be. It controls Active Directory in most places. Cloud administration of your Azure AD environment, that's tier 0. Mainframe controls, that's tier 0. I mean, you've got to look at this more broadly too, is what are the things that really matter to organization? What are their most sensitive systems? What is it that attackers really want? It's data. They go after data. That's why most attacks are pulling mail data from just about every organization when they can. If they can get in there and get access to email data, they will pull that first. If they can get in and pull other things off of shares, they'll pull that also. Because the data is often what matters. And that's why ransomware works so effectively, is it encrypts data. So now you don't have access to your data. So you're either losing data or you're losing access to your data. And losing in the term of people are copying it. So it's still there and you don't necessarily know that it's gone. But yeah, it's a big challenge, especially again, when you have these systems that are interconnected. So Active Directory domain controllers are typically virtualized on VMware. But the VMware admins are often in a group in Active Directory. Active Directory connects to Azure AD through Azure AD Connect. Global admins can jump from Azure AD over to Azure and control Azure. And Azure itself often hosts virtual DCs because a lot of companies now are using Azure or AWS as their cloud data center, their IaaS. So now you have 4 different discrete components that were never meant to really interconnect in this manner and have these integrations. I mean, Azure AD Connect, switched from synchronization for a number of years ago, right, Michael? From just synchronization to now we have pass-through authentication. We've got Azure AD Seamless Single Sign-On. We've got federation components. There's a number of things that Azure AD Connect actually facilitates. And I talked about Azure AD Connect back in 2017 at DEF CON being a concern in the environment because it's a big deal. Federation is another thing. ADFS. If you have ADFS, guess what? That's tier 0. Pretty much anything that manages identity and authentication falls under tier 0 and has to be focused on.
Yep, no, I definitely agree, right? Whether you call it tier 0 or like Microsoft likes to call it in their new model, the control plane or whatever it is, or privileged access plane. I mean, it still is an important thing, and it's the jumping from one to another that is becoming a problem. Earlier, someone put in the chat that, they disagree, that they think that AAD is a target, and I wholeheartedly agree, right? There's no need to disagree because, Sean and I are probably, right up there and agree that yes, it is, right? If, your AD is well secured and they have trouble getting in there, but you have a leak or something else up in the cloud that can be abused, and sure, they'll go there, whether it's an open storage account or key vaults that aren't properly secured, where, with a single access key, I can read any other key in the key vault, and that key gives me access to an app registration and allows me to create users, and bang, I've got now persistence in your environment. I mean, these are all things that happen all the time. So they are primary targets, primary citizens as well. And just because of that interconnection that Sean was talking about, it just becomes more complex because, 10 years ago when there was no cloud, well, 12, 15 years ago, when there was no cloud, right? Jesus, I'm dating myself. Then what you're seeing is that there was this one monolithic block called on-prem that you had to secure and look into and make sure that it's there. But now, single cloud, multi-cloud, God forbid, you've got 3 clouds running. There's 3 other sources that you have to look into. And what I think is a real problem is the fact that they all do things differently, right? The principles are the same, but how you control the security in Azure AD or Azure is different from how you do it in AWS, is different from how you do it in GCP. And imagine having to do it with all 3 or all 4 systems that or platforms that you're using. It just becomes a very complex something to look over.
Yeah, in order to date myself even further, NetWare admin here. So yeah, it's absolutely, Michael, and that's one of the challenges. Multi-cloud, a lot of organizations, they're like, we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket, so now we put all our eggs in 3 baskets, and the complexity increases because in Azure, I liken Azure to a Lego box. You basically have this Lego kit. You can put things together. There's instructions on how to do it. You have some pre-formulated things, and you can put it together pretty quickly. AWS is more like Tinker Toys, again, dating ourselves, putting things together, and it's just you create whatever you want to, including your IAM roles. And it's very easy to create these identity access and management roles in AWS that cause problems. Rhino Security is a fantastic script or tool for scanning through these IAM roles for things that are dangerous, because it's easy to so-called shoot yourself in the foot getting that configured. GCP is a bit newer, and I haven't looked into it that much, but I have looked at their managed Active Directory across all 3 of them. So now you don't just have AD on-prem, you could have a managed AD within Azure AD domain services, within AWS, so AWS managed AD, and then GCP managed AD, where they are managing and hosting it, and they're different between each other as far as their configuration goes. There's certain things you can do, certain things you can't do. And then you have your own Active Directory on-prem, which many have extended into that cloud data center, as I mentioned, be it Azure, be it AWS. We've seen some that's in both. So now you don't just have to manage and control that Azure environment, you also have to manage and control that AWS environment very closely, because a compromise of any of the accounts that has management or control or the ability to run a command, like I talked about DEF CON a couple years ago, where the VM contributor can basically run a command, it's a system, like run PowerShell. So once you have that sort of access on a virtual DC in Azure, then you run a command that adds a group or pulls the curve TDT or something like that, and then you compromise the on-prem environment without ever jumping the on-prem. Same thing in AWS. So there's these. I really see these integrations and the sort of dependencies between systems as the big issue. And again, I'm talking about it at TEC, about this identity nexus and how we've created this identity nexus, and the interconnectivity of all these things is our next big problem. It already is.
I'm a little overwhelmed right now, Sean. I mean, I'm hearing that we had the conversation on learning Active Directory. Like, hey, here's some other resources. And now I'm hearing, well, now you have to understand Active Directory, your VM infrastructure, AWS, Azure, and everything else kind of goes along with it. So no wonder things are at the state of the art, right? You can't
exactly. And then you throw in a third party like Okta, okay? And with Okta, I mean, with any third party, and I'm not trying to get on Okta's case here. Okta, Ping, what else is out there, right? The concern is that you are entrusting yourself. Cloud represent trust, right? You don't own it, you don't control it. You have to trust that it's managed appropriately. So any cloud service, you have to trust that. You have to trust Okta, for example. And I've had customers ask, well, can you look at the security configuration of Okta? And I was like, well, we don't have the experience to do that. And I don't know who does. So basically you trust the Okta folks that they are doing the right things on their side, right? Then you have something like Log4j, which affected a huge amount of systems. I mean, VMware Horizon was affected, and it took a week or two before that was fully understood. And those are systems that are typically connected to the internet. So through Log4j, now that attackers have a path potentially into the environment from the internet. We mapped out a path for a customer just this past fall along those lines of getting in and then escalating and compromising their AD. So it's a real challenge because you have these different systems, like you said, Brian. But the other part of it is knowledge. And I think in the environments that do have these teams, the VMware team is going to go, yeah, we've got VMware covered. AD is going to be like, we got AD covered. And it's really going to be up to security to start looking past these and trying to figure out, okay, well, how are we using these things? One of the things I talk to customers about regularly, especially when they have cloud systems, Azure AD, AWS, Okta, whatever it is to walk through how authentication works. Not just assume that's how it works, but walk through it. Because we've seen attackers actually attack a component of it, like the MDM system where the certificate is on the device. And so therefore, because it has a certificate, the user doesn't have to MFA because it puts in the token MFA, satisfied. So if you can compromise a system or part of a system that is in part of that authentication flow, you can bypass the entire MFA requirement. So there are things that have to be mapped out from a security perspective, understanding authentication end to end. So if you have a user that logs on to its workstation or his or her workstation on-prem and then connects to a cloud app, how does that authentication work? The identity team needs to know how that works, and the security team needs to know how that works. One of the things that CISA recommends to ensure the organization is prepared to respond if an intrusion occurs is conducting a tabletop. So a lot of people see a tabletop as something that, I got to hire a company to do. No, you can absolutely have your security and operations teams sit around a table and say, okay, what if this VMware ESXi host is compromised? What is the impact? What do we do? What if an Exchange server is compromised? What if an account in Azure that is a member of an Azure AD role that has privileged authentication role? What if that's compromised? What if a GA is compromised? How do we go through that? What is the process? What do we need to do? Tabletops are amazing opportunities and capability. And Black Hills Information Security has a game called Backdoors and Breaches, which can make the whole tabletop experience kind of fun, talking through, okay, well, here's what we could do. Here's what we could do. Oh, this card discounts that card. We have EDR. They bypassed EDR. What's next?
It kind of reminds me of like recovery exercises. We're obviously biased. We have a product. But I've even asked a customer before, well, if you need to restore Active Directory, who's making that decision? They're like, well, I'm assuming it's the CISO. Well, are you sure it's the CISO? Through practice, you learn a lot of those different scenarios. Now, the topic of ransomware, that keeps coming up. It's kind of scary out there right now. I'm seeing a lot of my customers being affected. Not everybody has our different product. So a big part of CISO advisory is testing your backup and protecting your backups. What do you feel organizations should be doing now to prepare for an actual disaster happening?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, it's not just one thing they should be doing, right? It's a whole plethora of things that you have to go through. And then referring back to the CSF from NIST, just because I like it so much, there's like all sorts of things that you have to go through. It's from protection to detection to response to recoverability. And recovering today is not just having a backup, but making sure that the backup you have is a secure backup. And what I mean with a secure backup, it's, making sure that that backup that you took a month ago, 2 months ago, right, the ones that you have aren't already compromised. Because what we see is that some organizations are breached, and then the attackers lay low for a while because they know that there is a 2-week, 2-month retention on the backups. So they want to make sure that they're in the systems with the backups already compromised. And then when they are sure that you can't revert back to something that doesn't have their backdoor anymore, then they'll launch an attack because you'll be restoring their backdoors, right? So you'll be granting them access again. And we see that as a real problem these days. Now, in effect to that, there's new solutions coming into the market that offer these scrubbed or scrutinized backups, where they will take a backup for you like other companies have done for years, but at the same time start scanning these backups regularly for new vulnerabilities, new backdoors based on intelligence that they find whenever they become public, which I think isn't an unnecessary luxury to have, because the world is changing, and unless you're sure that you haven't been breached, you better make sure that your backups are safe. And this is one of the ways of dealing with that, to make sure that you have recoverability, but just don't do it for everything, right? Just as Sean said, think to yourself, what do I need, right? What is my business running on, right? Let's assume that my entire environment is ransomware. Right? What do I need to be up and running again within the shortest possible time frame? Do you need all the systems to be up and running, or do you just need part of the systems? Just focus on the things that you need to do, because if you are just going to do the blanket, we do everything, then you're going to be paying a lot of money for that, and that just doesn't make any sense at all. But it starts with having a plan, understanding what the impact may be, and that is, number one to me. All too frequently, I work with customers when I ask them, like, what will you do, right, if today or tomorrow this happens? They just look at me blank and they're like, we don't know, or we have no idea what the impact would be. And that's scary, right? Not knowing what's coming for you when it's happening, that's a situation that I wouldn't want to be in.
Yeah, I have a few comments about backups because this is kind of close to my heart. The challenge that I see with probably about 20 to 30% of the customers we assess and review from an Active Directory standpoint is that they don't have good backups in Active Directory. So that's first and foremost. So if you can't back up, or if you can't recover that system that then controls everything else, you're in trouble. And so we've had customers that have said, all right, we have Commvault. And then we ask the next question, which is, well, do you have a system state backup? And the answer is no. So for everyone on the call, we had a customer that had ransomware attack them. They ransomed everything. Everything was encrypted. They had to recover from backup. They did not have a system state backup. They basically had to provide huge bags of money to Commvault, huge bags of money to Microsoft in order to get them recovered to the point where they could bootstrap up everything. Because backup systems like Commvault have a SQL server. That SQL server relies on Active Directory. So you need Active Directory in order to get back. So it's kind of like the old days when I was an Exchange admin, where we focused on dial tone. Basically, how do you get things working? That's why we had, 50 meg mailboxes back in the day, is to get the system up and running so that way people could receive email and do their work. That's why we ended up with PSTs that ended up being massive and ridiculous. But getting to that dial tone recovery. And there's a couple other parts of that. Probably the most important part is, okay, you're doing a backup. You're backing up all these systems. How often do you test recovery? It's like the old Seinfeld bit, you're taking the reservation. Anyone can take a reservation, you just can't hold the reservation. If you're taking the backups and you're not testing them, you're not checking them, you're really you're not proving anything. And then my last point on backups is, if you're backing up your domain controllers, who has access to that storage, who has access to that backup system, because anyone who has access to that can go back to backups from however long you've been using that system, even if you shifted to a newer system. And you're like, okay, this is just for domain controllers now, just for Active Directory. Whatever the old system is probably has old DC backups on it, which means that attackers could compromise that and then compromise the entire environment.
And I just want to add one point, because we deal in this space all the time, And there are a lot of traditional backup vendors that have a checkbox for Active Directory, which they can restore some data in the directory, but not the entire directory. In the ransomware scenario, there's a whole bunch of other steps that you have to do. You have to raise the RID pool. You have to, do the KRB TCT double tap, get that going. There are a lot of other different automated steps that must be done to make sure you're not going to cause more havoc, US and rollback issues later on. So if you've not tested for the ransomware scenario, one thing I urge all organizations to do is practice. See what your limitations are. Don't just take an offline copy of the DC, put it in your other lab environment, stand it up, and then test out your other applications. Test in the event that all DCs are down at the same time. Because we're seeing attackers, they'll get access to a GPO, a tier 0 GPO, deploy their payload, and shut out everything all at the same time. So that's a scenario that needs to be tested and practiced so you have a good comfort level in a very stressful situation of what you would do if that in fact did happen.
Yeah, I actually, and that's the reality now. I mean, I had put together a talk that we were submitting to Black Hat and DEF CON, and it was with a red team lead of a Fortune 10 company and a person who's like one of the best mainframe hackers in the world. And the talk was basically taking this concept of Die Hard 3, 4, where it was basically the concept of a fire sale in the movie. And of course, my mom calls me. She's like, "You know what a fire sale is, right?" I'm like, "I have no idea. They made it up in the movies." But the concept was that you take everything down at once. So when you take everything down at once, they can't do anything about it. So we had talked about actually how an attacker could take down an entire corporate environment, including the Active Directory, all the systems associated with that, and the mainframes that the company runs on. And at that point, there's really not much you can do in order to recover it, because if you time everything just right, you can lock everyone out of that environment. And you need a good recovery scenario for that sort of situation. And that's why it's also important to be looking at these interconnectivity components. Can an account in Active Directory manage your mainframe? I don't know. How would they talk? Who manages them and what systems are they using? Again, the interconnectivity of these systems has become critical because if you're doing backups in Active Directory and those are really good, are you backing up also your cloud environment, your Microsoft Office 365 environment, which maybe all your data is there now? Your SharePoint Online is hosting your OneDrive for Business, which means everybody's home drives now probably. And Teams has a lot of data in there now. Are those getting backed up? I can tell you from what I've seen, 80 to 90% of organizations are not doing any kind of backup in their cloud environment, and that's where the data is. So I fully expect a pivot of ransomware to shift from the on-prem stuff to the cloud stuff because all the APIs are there. All the programmatic stuff is there. Like, it's not going to be that difficult for them to shift over and start encrypting stuff in the cloud.
That's a little scary. And the other caveat before AD, if you're using info blocks like that, well, DNS has to be there before you can restore the directory. So yet another thing that you have to learn in dealing with Active Directory. Speaking about Microsoft 365, Azure Active Directory, resiliency, I mean, are there any other gotchas there that people should be concerned about as far as resiliency? I know we deal with.
Yeah. Please make sure you have an emergency break glass account. At least one. Microsoft recommends 2. Please just have one. There's too many organizations that don't even have one. Just please do that. Like, set that up today.
Monitor that account. Please monitor that account. It's easy. If you've got the Defender for Cloud Apps or Cloud App Security, just add an activity rule that whenever it is active, don't care. You get an alert, a text message, a phone call, don't care. It shouldn't be used ever. And if it is, then all bells and whistles should go off, even if it's you and you know that it's you, but monitor that account.
And if you don't have anything for cloud monitoring of the event logs or anything else, just use Sentinel. Just click. It's like 4 clicks. Just use that. It's very, very low cost, high fidelity. Just use that.
Wholeheartedly agree, right? And it's just basic hygiene. It's like these little things, right? It doesn't cost a lot. There's not a lot of effort involved in doing these things, but having that just may save you sooner or later. It's like an insurance. You do these things hoping you never need them, but if you do, you're happy you have them.
Going back to AD recovery, I was just thinking about, Ukraine, kind of circling back to the very beginning where they've lost internet connectivity. Elon Musk sent off the different Starlink things out there. I mean, are you advocating for your customers to have both physical backups as well as cloud stored backups? Do you have any preference there? Any thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, we worked with a customer that had a breach in December, and they had to take out their internet. They just had to unplug. Well, there you go. If you only have cloud backups, well, good luck. Then someone needs to go home, start downloading stuff from home, put it on a drive, and then, I mean, don't get me wrong, right? I'm a strong believer in everything that is cloud, but at the end of the day, connectivity isn't always guaranteed, right? Unless you have a physical backup. So at least for the super critical stuff, the basic things that you need, make sure that you have an offline copy somewhere, right? It isn't all that much effort. Just please do take it off site, right? Whether you should do it with an organization or put it in your briefcase and bring it home, I mean, that's a whole different story, right? At the end of the day, just make sure that you have some sort of, way of getting to an easy way of getting to your backup, because in the situation where internet goes down, and let's just look at Ukraine, where large parts just all of a sudden couldn't get to the internet anymore, then the reality kind of sinks in, doesn't it?
And please encrypt that backup if it's in your briefcase and you lose it or whatever, because that can cause a lot of damage.
Absolutely.
Right. And Dennis nailed it in chat. He said local, offline, remote. So 3 places at a minimum is where you should have your backups. For domain controllers, the easiest, most straightforward way, system state backup per FSMO per domain. That provides full coverage. At least do it once a week. I mean, obviously more frequently is better, but at a minimum, just do that as your own task. I've seen organizations that basically do crisscross across domain controllers, where they do a backup on a domain controller and then they copy that over to another DC. That way it's secured, it's on the domain controller. Only 80 admins should have access to it, but it's there.
Now, I know we'll go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I think you're about to give a time check. We've got just a handful of minutes. You want to ask one last quick question?
Well, I know both Michael as well as Sean are presenting at TEC. I know it's still a few months out. So maybe start with Sean and go to Michael. Sean, any ideas of what you plan on presenting at TEC? And I know it's a little bit early, but I'd love to drum up more excitement about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, my talk is called Defending the Identity Nexus, a bunch of the stuff I've talked about on this call. Specifically, I'm going to talk through a fictional company called Acme, of course, with Active Directory, VMware on-prem, Azure AD, and Azure in the cloud, how those things typically connect from what we've seen with customers. And I'm going to talk through scenarios of what attackers can do with that, how they can compromise any or all or different parts of the environment based on real-world configurations of what we've seen. And the most important part, talking about mitigations, ways to detect that, ways to stop them from doing it. So I'm excited about it.
And Michael, what do you plan on talking about at TEC this year?
So I've got to talk about supercharging your security operations with Microsoft Defender. But the goal of that is not just to talk about the product, but what the product brings, right? It's securing the systems and how that can actually help with basically everything that we were talking about today, making sure that you have proper protection, detection, and response capabilities built in, whether it's for on-prem AD or other tier 1, tier 2 servers. So really look forward to that.
All right, great. So I know we've talked a lot about Shields Up program today, figuring out how to reduce the likelihood of attack, different things to detect, some recommendations around that. Recovery, please prepare if you have not tested out your DR strategy and plan for the ransomware scenario. Please give that a try and schedule tabletop exercises. Jen, anything else that you want to add in to kind of close off the meeting today?
Yeah, well, just thank you to our panelists, Sean and Michael, for joining us. I'm looking forward to your sessions at TEC. There's been a lot of people asking about the chat. If you're in it right now, you can do the Control All and Copy. I will see if I can try to pull it out too. You can do Control All and Copy. It's kind of messy, but it's there. But the idea is that this amazing chat right here. This is what it's like at TEC, but you're actually in person. And you don't have to scroll through text. So I highly encourage folks to take a look at the Experts Conference, September 20 and 21 in Atlanta. We're getting word that Ignite might be virtual again. So I think some of these smaller Microsoft conferences are your chance to be in person. And if you're talking about AD training and education, I mean, this isn't like full on like AD training, but this is where you're going to go to get a lot of that education to fill in some of your knowledge gaps, be able to engage with Sean and Michael and our other experts that will be there, including Brian, who's doing a session on AD security during a migration. So definitely take a look at theexpertsconference.com, and we hope to see you there. Everyone, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean and
Thank you
Michael.
all
Thanks,
for joining.
everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks.